In the earliest hours of April 29, 2015, Indonesia executed 8 convicted drug dealers, 7 of which were not Indonesian. 2 were Australian, a Brazilian, and 4 Nigerians. This created a mix-up between the countries, and Brazil and Australia kicked out its ambassadors from Indonesia after also having these problems faced in January. 34 nations plus Gaza have imposed death penalty. Of those, at least 10 countries have death penalty for drugs as a mandatory sanction. Only of those 34 countries, only 4 are outside the Middle East or Asia. And only in 6 countries, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Singapore, drug offenders are known to be routinely executed.
So, imagine you're arriving to Changi Airport in Singapore. You have your baggage, and someone else had your key to that baggage. Suddenly, officials stop you. They say, please, open your luggage. Suddenly, they find a couple of interesting things. They have Spider-Man socks and Star Wars socks, but they also find some cocaine and some heroin. So as you can see, it's very little what they found for that. But since you're in Singapore, you will be sentenced to death. No trial, no highway option, just death penalty. This happens in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Iran, China, and Saudi Arabia, as Mahfouz has already mentioned. So our main problem here is what happens with the international relations of such states when having capital punishment on drug trafficking. Drug trafficking is an important problem to a lot of countries worldwide, especially Asian countries. Why? Because they have drug coming from the Middle East, drug coming from Latin America. So the production and consumption of drug is really important, and smugglers are dealt with through capital punishment. So let's explore the cases a bit further. In both Malaysia and Singapore, there's something that's called a mandatory punishment. So even if you have a very low amount career of drugs, you will be sentenced to death. In the case of Iran, it's a bit different because it's considered a national emergency since a lot of drug was coming in from Afghanistan. But the relations of such countries have been damaged in several ways, but we'll get to that later. First, some cases.
The first case, for example, in Malaysia is the case of Fasila B. Abdul Karim, which is this lady here. She arrived to the Malaysian airport as a 62-year-old as a tourist. Then, what we said happened. Police officers arrived to her suitcase and started checking her, and they said she was trying to smuggle 2.9 kilograms of methamphetamines. Her response that she was coming to work to Malaysia, and that wasn't hers, and someone had smuggled it in her bag. The decision of the court was that she was lying, that she came through a tourist visa, and so she was sentenced to death at 63. Another case is the Bali 9 case that was in Indonesia. It was 9 Australians sentenced to death because they were carrying 2.8 kilograms of ketamine. The Australian government actually reported they were coming with a huge amount of methamphetamine, but the Singapore government decided that those non-Australians were going to be sentenced to death. The impact of this case is that the Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd tried to talk to the President of Indonesia, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and he rejected its personal clemency. And the President further rejected similar diplomatic efforts from Australia Foreign Minister and Australian Embassy, and the death penalty was sentenced, and 2 Australians died in 2005. And another one of the big cases right now in Singapore is the Singapore facing the damage to the international community because there was a case of Young Hui Kong versus the public prosecutor. He was a Malaysian, and the prosecutor said that death penalty was in order because he was carrying drugs in his bag, but they fought because they were unconstitutional in 2 rounds, and even though they had a right, the international system secured them, they didn't care, and he still got death penalty in 2010, and he was murdered in 2011.
So let's put these cases into perspective. We don't like to generalize between East versus West, but in this case, we can see it really thoroughly. In the case of the West, usually policies against drug trafficking and drug smuggling include jail or another type of punishment, which is not capital punishment. And even in some countries as Great Britain, well, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Netherlands, and even some states inside the United States, another type of Caribbean island as Jamaica, which is a part of UK, there is an open door policy for some drugs, especially marijuana, and especially regarding medical marijuana. So this happens in the West. You may smuggle a really small amount of marijuana and you will not be sentenced to death, you will be questioned, you will be maybe taken to jail, but that's it. So what happens in Eastern countries like those we have exposed? There is no other way out. There is no conception of human rights in these cases. Even though some organizations like Amnesty International or even councils, the Council of Human Rights inside the UN, have said that these countries should not have any type of capital punishment, they still don't abide to international law. And we believe that this is damaging the relations between those countries and international organizations. Such is the case of Iran, where the UNOCD, which is the UN Committee for Drugs and Narcotics, took away the contributions and the expenses for Iran to fight against drugs because Iran still would take people into capital punishments. So like $1 billion were taken away from Iran just because they still had this punishment. The relation between Malaysia and the Mexican government was also damaged in 2012, where 3 Mexicans from Culiacan, Sinaloa were sentenced to death. And so the same happened in the case of Singapore, where Brazilian and Australian ambassadors left the country because of such cases.
There has also been struggle between Britain and countries like Switzerland because they do authorize heroin as an illness. So countries like that have free needles and clean needles so that people can treat themselves. And countries like Singapore and Malaysia have gone against this country because they say it's not rational for them to give these kind of utensils to people that are sick because for them it's illegal, but the West keeps fighting because they have a whole other perspective and that puts in damage their relationships.
We believe that a prohibition perspective and a capital punishment perspective is worse for the countries than actually an open door policy for certain drugs and for cooperation between states through a supranational institution or organizations. We believe that capital punishment in Eastern Asian countries should stop if they want to make their international relations better.